In Alaska's endless snow, there are places not on any map. Alaska hides more than ice and silence.
Alaska, land of silence, snow, and secrets buried deeper than the permafrost. Some places aren't meant to be found, like a cabin that carves your face into its walls. Some things aren't meant to be heard, like whispers hidden inside the northern lights, calling you by name. And some shadows aren't meant to be followed, like the barefoot figure that walks your trail step for step. These are not campfire tales. They're accounts from trappers, scientists, and rangers, people who swore they'd seen the land itself turn against them. Tonight you'll hear their stories and decide for yourself if Alaska's just cold wilderness or something alive, watching, waiting, and whispering. They say Alaska is too vast for any man to truly know, but I've always disagreed. My name is Amos, and I've lived in the interior most of my life. The land has raised me, scarred me, and taught me more than any book ever could. I know the folds of the Tanana River, like I know the lines on my hands. Every trail where moose tread, every hollow where the lynx likes to hide. But last winter, in the deep silence of the taiga, I found something I wish I had never seen. The snow was falling in lazy sheets that morning, muffling the snap of my boots as I checked my traps. The sky was a pale bruise, heavy with storm, but I pressed on, rifle strapped across my back. I thought I knew what waited for me out there: frozen steel, animal tracks, the endless white. Instead, I saw smoke, thin and gray, rising just beyond the trees. It didn't make sense. There was no cabin marked here, and no trappers within miles. My chest tightened, but my curiosity tugged me closer. Through the thicket, it came into view: a log cabin, standing proud against the snow, roof heavy with ice. The wood looked old, weathered, as if it had stood for years. But I'd passed this stretch more times than I could count. I stood frozen, staring at the plume curling from its chimney. A cabin with smoke meant someone lived there, but the snow around it lay untouched. No sled tracks, no snowshoe prints, not even a stray paw. My gut whispered to leave, but my boots carried me forward anyway. The door was ajar. Thin creak echoed as the wind shifted it. I called out, my voice low, cautious. No reply, only the gentle crackle of fire inside. The warmth hit me first as I stepped through, but it wasn't the fire that froze me where I stood. The walls, every inch of them, were carved with faces, hundreds of them, and every single one was mine. The scar on my cheek, the slope of my brow, the tired eyes I'd seen reflected in rivers. Some looked fresh, raw wood still curling at the edges. Others seemed older, their grooves darkened with time, as if they had been etched years before. My rifle slipped from my shoulder and clattered against the floorboards. The sound was deafening in that place, but the faces did not move. They only stared. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and brushed my fingers over one of the carvings. The detail was impossibly wrinkled, every notch of my beard. These weren't guesses. Whoever or whatever had done this knew me, had been watching me. Panic surged, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. I bolted out into the snow, my breath tearing from my lungs. The silence outside felt heavier now, pressing down against my ears. I ran until my legs burned, until I reached my snowmobile. The engine roared like salvation, carrying me away from that impossible cabin. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally reached my own cabin, I slammed the door shut and stoked the fire high, as though heat could burn away what I'd seen. I told myself it had to be exhaustion, a trick of the storm, or a fevered hallucination. But the memory of those faces followed me into my dreams, And when I awoke the next day, I knew I had to prove to myself that it wasn't real. So I returned this time with a friend. We followed the same trail, trudging through drifts, the air sharp with cold. But where the cabin had stood was nothing. No chimney, no door, no carvings. Only flat, undisturbed snow stretching in every direction. I felt my throat close. My friend laughed, said I'd mixed up my landmarks, but I knew. I knew I hadn't imagined the smell of the fire or the sting of the warmth on my skin. Something had been there, and now it was gone. That night, when I returned to my cabin, a new sound greeted me. The scrape of steel against wood. At first I thought it was the wind, until I stepped closer and saw it etched into the surface of my own table. My face, smaller than the others, but just as perfect. I sat staring at it for hours, the fire burning low. I hadn't carved it. My friend hadn't carved it. And yet, it was there, etched into the grain of the place I considered my refuge. And that was when I knew. Cabin had not vanished. It simply found me. Since that night, the land hasn't felt like it belongs to me anymore. The forest no longer hums with life the way it once did. Every creak of the trees, every rustle in the brush, it all feels like footsteps. Circling, watching, waiting. I moved my traplines farther out, hoping to put distance between myself and whatever curse had followed me. But distance means nothing out here. The snow carries sound too well, and sometimes, long after I've doused the lantern, I hear boots crunching outside my walls, slow, careful, circling. The locals whisper about it when they VA had too much whiskey, the cursed cabin that Dose and Tea stay in one place. Some say it appears to men who've spent too long in the wilderness, offering them warmth before it claims their likeness. Others swear it carves you into its walls to keep you a trophy for eternity. I never listened to old stories. I do now, because the faces keep multiplying. At first it was only the carving in my table. Then I found another on the handle of my axe. Then on the doorframe, shallow but unmistakable. Every day I find a new one. Always my face, always perfect. And when I catch myself in the mirror now, I swear the reflection lags, as though it's being copied, carved in some unseen place before returning to me. Last week I woke to the smell of smoke, not from my own chimney but drifting faintly through the cracks. I opened the door and froze. Out in the tree line a plume rose into the sky, just as it had before. The cabin was back, waiting. I should have stayed inside, locked every bolt, but something in me wanted to see, to prove. I followed the smoke. And there it was. Standing in the snow, untouched, as though it had never left. The door was open again. Firelight spilled across the drifts. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it through the doorway, lit by the fire. The walls were covered in faces. Hundreds, maybe thousands. And not just mine anymore. Men, women, strangers I'd never seen. Some screaming, some silent, their expressions twisted in agony or fear. They covered every surface. And among them, freshly cut into the wood, was one more, a carving of my friend. The one who had laughed when he saw nothing. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My mind screamed to run, but my body was rooted in the snow. The cabin pulsed with heat, like a living thing. For a moment, I swore I heard the faces whisper, a low chorus of voices breathing my name. I fled, crashing through the trees until the world blurred around me. When I finally reached my cabin, I locked the door and shoved furniture against it, though I knew wood and nails couldn't stop something like that. Now I wait, night after night, listening to the footsteps that circle slower each time, as though they're waiting for me to open the door. I don't sleep much anymore. I can't, because sometimes I hear the scrape of steel inside, even though I'm awake. When I light the lantern, I find new carvings on the walls, each one a little closer to the bed. Last night I found one carved into the headboard itself. My own face, eyes closed as though already asleep. I know the cabin will come again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week. But it will. And when it does, it won't need to wait for me to step inside. Because it's already here. They told me the sky keeps its secrets, but no one told me the sky might answer back. My name is Dr. Priya Sharma. I study the Aurora up here, barrels of data, nights hunched over monitors, the cold a constant hum against the window. Became an Aurora scientist because the lights felt like language, patterns, rhythm, a conversation between sun and sky. In 2024, the lights started answering me. That winter, the Aurora was greedy with color ribbons of green and purple that skated and tore across the horizon like silk. Nights were long. The observatory became a small island of light amid white and black. On the third night of a particularly vivid storm, I tightened the gain on my antenna because the instruments were jittering. The screen bloomed with pulses that didn't match usual geomagnetic chatter. At first I thought it was interference, a satellite, a faulty cable, some mundane human noise bleeding into my receiver. I adjusted filters, rerouted feeds, did everything you do when you refuse to admit you are the one being seen. My headphones picked up something else entirely, a texture of sound I hadn't cataloged layered, low, like a crowd murmuring just out of reach. I recorded, I looped the clip, and listened until the hum resolved into syllables, then into words. Priya, CS. The phrase repeated, patient as tide. At first I told myself I was reading patterns into noise. The same way you see shapes and frost humanity's hunger for meaning projecting itself onto random data. I told the team the next morning with a smile that was too thin. They laughed, called it radio ghosts. They heard nothing in the clips, only static. When you study the sky long enough, you start keeping companion rituals. A particular mug, a worn notebook, a map with coffee stains. That night, the lights seemed to watch me like a live audience. Whenever I stepped into the cold outside the observatory, the aurora brightened, folding into shapes that lingered at the peripheral vision, curved hands, a suggestion of faces. It was the kind of sight that makes the jaw loosen and words fail. I kept my voice low in the control room, as if speaking might make those shapes settle into question. By the third night, I was alone. My team had gone into town for supplies, a standard rotation, but the silence in the building was different then. The light outside seemed to bend inward. I stayed up because curiosity is a dangerous doctor. The whispers in the headphones grew in confidence. They learned cadence. They began to name small, private things. The original name of my childhood home, fear I'd not voiced aloud since I was 10. The exact place on my arm where the mole lived. They were intimate, like someone reading pages of a diary I thought locked. I scribbled notes until the paper trembled. The frequencies folded into visual patterns on my screen, pulse after pulse, aligning like dots connecting themselves. I mapped them against known Morse codes, ancient binary. Even a handful of indigenous star lore symbols for the sake of rigor. None matched. The pattern repeated the phrase Priya, CS, but sometimes it came slurred, like the end of a sentence torn off by wind. CS. As if whatever was speaking was learning how to pronounce my name. Sleep became a thin film I kept tearing. When dreams came, they were not random. I'd stand at the edge of a frozen inlet and watch the aurora stitch itself into a face that was not quite human. It would lean, and I'd feel the illusion of a hand trailing the hair at the back of my neck. I woke certain I'd felt breath that was not mine. I told my team again when they returned, and this time one of them stayed with me at the console until dawn. We replayed the files. On standard headphones and the cheap earbuds our field kits have, there was only static. On my research-grade monitors, with the gain set to the anomalous band, and the noise reduction algorithms off, could hear the whisper under the static, a chorus of layered breaths, shaping syllables. They claimed it was a software artifact. I couldn't T-shake the way the lights outside leaned in the exact moments the recording said my name. People in Barrow tell stories to make sense of the world. They told me about old sky spirits, about lights that had always been alive to someone. I'd been trained to weigh folklore and data equally, to hold myth to the same rigor as measurement. But there is a difference between oral history and the intimate feel of a voice that seems to know the way you count your sins. On the seventh night, the aurora arranged itself into rhythm so precise, my spectrogram looked like someone had typed a sentence. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language my colleagues or I could place, yet there was that tremor of intent and insistence in the pulses. I tuned the microphone, slowed the playback, and in the slow unfurl I heard it clean. Priasus. The words arrived like footsteps at the edge of sleep, inevitable and close. I knew with a clarity that was almost violent that something out there wanted me to look up and meet its eyes. I stood at the window, palms pressed to cold glass, and watched the aurora gather itself like a living thing. The shapes coalesced faces and hands stretching like the waves of a frozen tide until a single silhouette paused above the observatory, held there and seemed to look right through the roof. My headphones went silent for a fraction of a second, a breath stolen from the world. Then, over the silence, the voice spoke my name in a tone I had never heard from any human. Not a word, but a recognition. I reached for the recorder with hands that did not feel like mine and pressed play. The waveform glowed back, and in the center of that spike, clear as a bell, was my name again. I should have burned the file then. Instead, I sat and listened until the lights bent into shapes I could no longer name. And the observatory felt less like shelter and more like a throat. At dawn, when the sky washed itself into pale, I realized I had two recordings. The one on my device, and a lingering, awful certainty that somewhere on that pale band of light a pattern had been left addressed to me. The aurora had stopped pretending to be weather. It started to be a summons. When you are told by the sky to come, the sensible response is to stay put, to fortify, to document. I did the opposite. I wanted to prove I was not going mad. I wanted to map whatever intelligence bent the lights and expose it under a microscope and code. I became reckless in the way scientists sometimes become reckless pursuing a question until it breaks you. The next nights blurred into a sequence of experiments. I threaded more sensitive antennas through the ridge, strapped magnetometers to old tree stumps, and left geophones to eavesdrop on the ground itself. The aurora answered each adjustment as if it were a conversation, altering brightness and frequency in response to my configuration. When I shifted a dial, the lights pulsed in sympathy, like an organism acknowledging being touched. The whispers learned patience. I began to place names in a list, slow and ceremonial. Strangers' names I'd never heard, followed by dates and tiny facts, a ledger of lives. In the flicker between the aurora's colors, I began to see movement not as light, but as memory. Shapes formed and dissolved with the cadence of a sentence, and sometimes a face would hold long enough for me to recognize an age I did not yet have, and a sorrow I could not name. My colleagues argued for evacuation. The administrators worried about optics, about the reputational damage of a national observatory seeming to chase ghosts. The town gossiped, eyes narrowing when I walked through the market. They made jokes about being called by the northern lights, but the whispering invaded things you cannot easily fix with policy. My handwriting changed. My appetite waned. My hands started to tremble when the aurora thickened. I found myself listening for a pause in the chorus, waiting for a particular cadence that meant they were speaking to me. One night, the aurora braided itself into an unmistakable pattern-an image that filled the sky like a tape of light. It mirrored with cruel fidelity the photograph of my mother I keep in a drawer, the tilt of her chin, the line of her smile. I staggered backwards and felt the room grow small and dense. The whispers did not name her, but hinted at a memory that she had once spoken to the lights and been answered. I had not known this. The spectrogram lodged a repetitive motif in my head, a tiny loop of frequencies that matched the pitch of my mother's voice when she sang lullabies. I closed my eyes and the lullaby played under the static, warm and impossible. I stopped sleeping at all. The aurora took up residence behind my eyelids. When I finally drifted into shallow doze, I woke to my own voice in the headphones older, tremulous, murmuring a phrase I had never spoken. I hit rewind. The file, when slowed, revealed a hidden layer beneath my recorded commentary, a voice that was mine, but from a cadence I did not possess yet, saying, "Come, we have been waiting." Panic is a ladder you climb away from reason. I bolted the doors and nailed planks over windows, packed my most precious instruments into cases, and made a plan for rapid transport. Get to the plane, call for a lift to Fairbanks, and never return. But the world I knew had already shifted. Patterns of light began to appear not only overhead but in my instruments. Logs, threads of signal that synchronized across devices and locations, like a choir rehearsing. The night I thought to leave, a storm rolled in that made the sky feel like a drum. The aurora divorced color from pattern and became something you could feel in your teeth. Outside, suspended above the snow, a shape unrolled slowly, a ladder of light descending toward the ground in segments that looked exactly like steps. It paused over the observatory door as if considering entry. The whispers tightened into a single voice that was both chorus and person. "Priya." Every instinct screamed at me to run for the plane. Instead, my legs took me to the threshold. I stood less like a woman making a choice than like a figure moved by a magnet. The door was an idea, a membrane between two logics. I felt the air press inward, sounded like the inhale, before a crowd begins to chant. I lifted my face to the stare of light, and the aurora folded around me like a cloak. For a breathing moment, there was no other sound than my heartbeat. Then the light pressed close, and the voices thick as river ice spoke my name in a dozen pasts and futures. They knew me because they had kept a ledger of being known. They had names I had never heard, and they offered me a place in a sentence that, if I accepted, would never end. I reached out, hesitant, fingertips trembling toward a strand of light. It was cold as polished glass and older than the bones of the earth. My hand met it, and the world seemed to detonate into information faces. Coordinates, dates, memories that were not mine slid across my mind like transparent film. I saw an old man I did not know, smiling as if I had been promised something. I saw myself, older and certain, arranging instruments with hands that no longer shook. A voice, my voice, undeniably mine, whispered behind the light, "Come home." And then the recorder left on the table, clicked off by some unseen hand. The log shows a single minute of silence skewed by a spike at the end, a waveform that looks like a pulse, and then nothing. When the team broke down the door the next morning, the observatory was empty. My coats were folded neatly on the rack. My coffee sat cooling at the table, a thin film across the surface. My station hummed with a residual pattern of the previous night's auroral script, looped now and now again. They found the equipment, but no me. The files ID left were corrupted at the final second, where my last movements should have been recorded. There is instead a hollow space and layered under. Static, a faint voice that is not humans, or quite mine. The last clear clip plays a whisper, simple and certain. "Priya, see you stay." After that, a breath. Then a sound like someone closing a book. People ask the question everyone asks when someone disappears. Why her? The town split into those who said she walked into the light by choice, and those who said she'd been taken. Scientists argued about cognitive hallucination and electromagnetic anomalies. The files circulated and were tinkered apart by engineers and hobbyists, until the original edges were worn smooth. But the thing that keeps me from being only a case study is this. In the months since, when the aurora flares over other skies, there are recordings from far-off stations, camper radios, emergency dispatches, a child's toy walkie-talkie that pick up a whisper layered under their own static. A voice that says, in a tone both invitation and warning, "Priya, come home." They tell you the backcountry keeps its own hours, that the land remembers who walks on it. I used to believe that was bluster from old rangers trading stories by kerosene lamps. My name is Nate Collins. I patrol the Denali backcountry. I know the sound a lynx makes at midnight, the way a storm smells before it arrives, the rhythm of my own boots over packed snow. Last February, on a dusk run near Cantwell, something found the rhythm of me and started to walk along with it. The sky was the color of bruised cobalt, the world stripped down to black pines and a plain of sugar white. My headlight cut a clean tunnel through the blue, metal, and breath and the low thrum of the snowmobile. Tracks showed up first big bare, like someone had walked the trail without boots. At -20, barefoot prints make a man laugh and curse in the same breath. They should not exist. Still, I followed because the woods under this sky are thinner on excuses and heavier on answers. The prints led to a clearing and then stopped, as if the walker had taken a step off the world. I swept the beam in a slow arc. Nothing moved except for snow smoking off the branches. That's when I saw the shadow. Long, lean, an edge at the edge of my light, keeping pace with the machine. It didn't ripple like the shadow of trees. It moved like a man turning when I turned, leaning when I leaned always. A hair's breadth out of reach. I hollered, half laugh and half warning. "Hey, who's out there?" My voice slid thin across the cold and came back to me as my echo. My radio squealed into white noise as if someone had thrown a blanket over the frequency. I keyed the mic and called in my position. Static, not interference. Deliberate silence, like the air had been told to stop carrying testimonies. The shadow matched every nuance of my handling, an impossible tale never revealing more than a silhouette, never letting the light find the thing that cast it. I gunned the sled, engine coughing into speed, and the shadow kept pace along the tree line, a patient mimic at the edge of my reach. For the first time in years, my stomach felt hollow as a drum. I made it back to the ranger cabin with my hand shaking, and told the other rangers over coffee that I'd seen a man walking without boots. They raised eyebrows and swapped superstitions without much weight, which is how a small station keeps its heart steady. I slept badly, every noise outside my walls a question. When dawn unstitched the dark, we went back to the clearing. The prints were gone, the snow pristine, as if set by some careful hand. My friends chalked it up to drift, and my eyes to frostbite. But I knew the pattern of the ground. I know where a track should hold and where it should wash. This wasn't weather, it was a message. That night I took the long route home, because men who see things on their beat often misplace their courage at the threshold of the familiar. The snowmobile's lights made columns of gold through the trees, and for a while nothing shadowed me. Then, under a stand of gray spruce, the crunch of snow synchronized with mind, another set of steps keeping time, a slow counterpoint. I stopped to listen. The sound stopped. I moved. The sound moved. It was a game played by rules I didn't know. I came to dread the sound of my own feet after that. Each night I checked the perimeter, walked circuits with my flashlight, and every night the crunch outside would mirror me. It was never the full shape of a personal breath at the jamb of the door, no silhouette at the window, just the echoing heels in the snow that matched my own cadence. When I tried to outpace it, the extra crunch would accompany me as though some invisible twin kept up. I started leaving a trail of small markers, bits of cloth, flagging tape, a twig bent 3 times. In the morning, the markers were where I left them, but fresh barefoot prints had circled them, careful and deliberate, like a visitor examining a collection. Locals call them watchers, a half-joke with the weight of warning. Old women in the post office told me about people who come home to find their porches set with strange things. Hunters who say they felt a presence walk the perimeter and then vanish. I listened to these tales for years, with the professional distance of a man who believes most stories are the night's way of keeping people company, not anymore. The laughable became personal when I found the prints next to my snowmobile. Large and human, leading up to the sled and stopping as if whoever walked had stepped into the dark and melted away. The pattern tightened. The scrapes and crunches circled my cabin more frequently. And sometimes they matched the way I moved inside. 2 steps to the heater, a pause, another step to the shelf. Once, while filing paperwork, I heard the footsteps halt right outside the window where I was sitting. A careful pause, as if the watcher read the way I breathe. I stood slowly and peered out. The clearing was empty, but for old tracks that did not match the new rhythm. When I turned back to the room, something had pressed a shallow smear into the frost on the inside of the window. An outline, elongated, not quite a hand, not quite nothing. I started taking different routes on patrol and changing the times I left, hoping unpredictability would unthread the mimic. It didn't. The shadow matched every alteration with unnerving fidelity. Once, when I doubled back in a figure 8 to throw it off, I found 2 sets of fresh barefoot prints running parallel to the snowmobile ruts, like twin hands tracing my path. The first part of this became a story I told quietly at shift change, voice low, eyes scanning for smirks that didn't belong. I tried logic in a limb, someone foolishly out without boots, optical illusion from headlight glare. Each theory wore thin and then frayed. The more I tried to pin the phenomenon to a mundane route, the more the woods resisted. I felt like I was under observation by some patient thing that preferred not to be caught in the act, that wanted only to be counted and then to be left. On the last night of my rotation, before I swore not to set that route again, I sat up late and listened with a new kind of attention. The snow outside made the same measured sounds, but then I heard something else. A whisper of cloth against snow, and a breath that did not belong to any wind. It matched the pace of my own breathing. I opened the door a crack, and the night smelled like crushed cedar and old cold. The beam from the headlights slashed out and found nothing but the pale outline of new tracks leading away from the cabin into the tree line, disappearing as if the world had swallowed them. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, fingers numb and teeth bared against the air. Whatever walked outside that night had the patience of waiting for a man to calm before it moved. After that night, the line between my waking hours and the watcher's schedule blurred. I thought leaving the route would be enough. Rearrange the map, change the routine, refuse to feed the pattern. It didn't matter. The thing that mirrored me was not tied to geography as much as to the cadence of me. It learned me. The steps escalated from an annoyance into a presence that threaded itself through small, constant things. My foxing boots, wet from melt and tucked by the heater, had prints pressed into the mat beside them. But not my Prince Bear imprints, angled at an impossible slant, as if whoever made them had walked on the outside of my life. One morning I opened my locker and found a single bear footprint stamped on the inside of the lid, tiny scars of frost making the shape clear. No mud tracked in, no sign of anyone entering, yet the mark was there, patient and accusing. I stopped sleeping in a single bed and began to sleep with the light on, the heater low and loud. The steps outside learned to time themselves to the lulls in my breath. I could begin to predict when they would pause 2 steps after I turned on the radio, a slow shuffle when I fixed a cup of coffee. Predictability, I discovered, was the thing that made it comfortable. It wasn't hunting me to frighten. It was learning to be me. One night, desperate to call the bluff, I went out in the dark barefooted and left my snowmobile running, the windshield fogging with my breath. The cold raked at my ankles like knives, but I stood there and waited. The snow crunched not far off, slow and measured, and then the steps stopped. I stepped forward and the air felt tight, compressed with the scent of old pines and something like old wool. I moved my hand through the snow where the steps led and felt nothing but frozen crystals. I held my palms steady and then, with a fold of hesitation, pressed my hand down where the prints had been. My fingers met empty cold, and then something pressed back, soft as a palm, flat and impossibly warm, then gone. The hair on my arm rose. I laughed then, a brittle sound that broke in the trees. The watchers, the old-timers, said in the post office, sometimes mirror to learn, sometimes to replace. I told myself those were the stories folks told to make sense of bad nights. But sense began to slip. One morning I woke to find the cabin door unlatched, though I remembered bolting it. A line of barefoot prints led from the threshold into the dark, away from the building, not toward it. They were not mine, and yet their stride matched mine. They led out on a careful curve and stopped at the edge of the light, where my headlamp would cut through if I chased them. I did chase them, because men do stupid things to prove they are not afraid. I followed until the trees closed and the trail vanished. When I came back 2 hours later, the prints led back to the porch and up the steps, ending at the threshold of my own bunk. I stared at the faint depressions in the snow and felt a drift of nausea. Something had walked out and then walked back in and had been inside my hut while I was gone. I checked my pockets, my gear, the logbooks. Nothing missing, nothing added. Only the unease that someone had studied the way I dressed, the way I made coffee, the angle at which I set my hat on the peg. Then it turned from mimicry into imitation. I found on a scrap of paper left under my map, careful series of strokes marks that matched my handwriting and pressure, if not in full shape. Whoever left it had been watching me write. The next night, when the footsteps moved along the edge of the clearing, they carried a rhythm that matched the way I tap my foot when I think. They had learned to be small details of me. Panic crept into the edges where reason once stood. I spoke to leadership and was told to file reports and to secure the perimeter. I did the paperwork in side-ent forms, GPS markers, timestamps, attached cameras at the eaves, and left motion sensors running. The footage was a joke of pixels and light. Nothing conclusive, only the hint of movement where the resolution broke. The sensors triggered at odd hours with no visible cause. One camera caught a smear of shadow that looked like a man at 30 frames per second, and then for a single frame one, blink it showed what looked like my back. We replayed it until the image blurred into static. The strain showed itself in small betrayals. I would smell the faint iron temps of blood and check my hands, even though there was none. I woke once to find a single wet smear on the pillow where my cheek had been, not old, and not fresh, as if something had pressed its mouth there and left a history I could not read. I told myself this was exhaustion, a breakdown of sensory filters. The town's jokes tasted like thin ice. A few of the old-timers stopped letting me into their stories. I saw their looks a mix of pity and something that might have been fear. That is how isolation grows. In the silence between your footsteps and the echo that follows. One night the watcher broke its rules. Steps came up the path and did not skirt the tree line. They marched straight to the cabin door and stopped. I watched from the window as the snow around the door sank and made a perfect outline like a body laid just beyond the threshold. I could see the breath mark on the glass where a face might press to peep inside. My hands were clenched on the sill until my knuckles went numb. I opened the door because some part of me wanted to know if bravery could meet the thing it feared. The cold hit like a slap. The air smelled of wet wool and evergreen and a faint metallic thing I could not name. There, in the light, were prints lending away footprints that matched mine perfectly. They led not into the wilderness but away down the maintenance road, toward a cut in the trees I had never taken. They left the world of rangers and headed deeper. I dressed and followed, heart a drum in my throat, calling into the dark. The trail led to the place where my snowmobile had been parked the week before and stopped. There was no sled. Only an impression in the snow, as if something heavy had been dragged forward and then lifted. My breath fogged and formed a slow hand in the blue light. At the edge of the cut I found a single object half buried. My own hat folded with the lining turned out. Inside, pressed into the wool, was a tiny, careful imprint, like the negative of a face, elongated and wrong, and in it, the last thing I would ever want to read, the pattern of my own teeth. As if someone had pressed their mouth to the fabric and left me a message I could not unpack. I stood there a long time, the cold biting down through my jacket, and understood that whatever had watched me had begun to replace the details of my life with its own versions. The mirroring had been a prelude. I turned back, but the steps that followed matched mine closer than they ever had before, slipping into my footprints like a shadow sliding into skin. When I reached the cabin, the light was already dimming, and for the first time, the pattern outside sounded not like accompaniment, but like a pair of hands folding something away. No, I don't take that route. I don't pretend the tracks are just tracks. I check the cabin windows twice before I sleep. Most nights the snow outside is quiet, pretending at being innocent. But when I lie awake, I hear the slow, patient mirror of my breath outside the walls. And sometimes in the pause, there is an extra sound, the scraping of bare feet stepping lightly over new snow. Just at the edge of the light, matching the exact way I turn my head when someone calls my name. I do not go back. I do not need to find out if the watching becomes taking. In Alaska, the snow can bury a man and keep his shoes by the door, can keep things that want to be what you are until the world forgets to ask which of you is the original.